guys. All right, so this is our second to last lecture on decolonization, and we're going to be focusing on Kemal Ataturk and the way that he modernized the country of Turkey. But before we get to that, let's take a look at our do now. So in this do now, we see an event that's being pictured, and if we look at our sourcing information, we see that it is in Berlin, Germany in 1945. So we're looking at the event that's being depicted, and then why is it historically significant? So if we look at this event, we can see that obviously Berlin has been destroyed, but hopefully what you're noticing is that flag that is right there in the center of the image. That flag, if you're not aware, is the Soviet flag. So we want to be thinking about why would the Soviet Union be in Berlin when Berlin is destroyed, and what event is coming to an end in 1945. So our objective today is to list the modernizations made by Kemal Ataturk and discuss their short-term and long-term impacts on Turkey. So none like, Iran and a couple other countries that we have talked about, some Middle Eastern nations were, perfectly fine with embracing Western ways. And Turkey is the nation that is highlighted in green there. It is the pretty much what we consider the gateway into Europe. It's right there on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. It used to be the Ottoman Empire. And before that, it was part of the Roman Empire. And then it became the Byzantine Empire before fully becoming part of the Ottoman Empire. And then when the Ottoman Empire falls, it becomes the nation of Turkey. So when we are looking at it, the Ottoman Empire was considered the sick man of Europe. It fell under foreign domination in the 19th century. They lost a lot of territory. So when we looked at the Ottoman Empire, it's going to fall after 1919, at the end of World War I. It's going to be one of the conditions of their surrender. Now, when they were at their height, they included large portions of Africa, large portions of most of the Middle East, but slowly but surely they just went down to what is pretty much known as the nation of Turkey today. So in 1919, Ottoman Empire was defeated as part of the Central Powers in World War I, and their conditions under the Treaty of Versailles was that their empire had to break up and the nation of Turkey was created. Now, if you might remember when we talked about World War I, where we talked about the Young Turks and we talked about the rise of this nationalist movement during the Ottoman Empire in reference to the Armenian genocide. These are the same Young Turks. So Mustafa Kemal, who becomes known as Kemal Ataturk, unifies Turkey and begins the process of westernizing the country. But that group that he's in charge of was the same group that committed all those atrocities against the Armenians during World War I. So Ataturk sees the adoption of Western technology and customs as a key to Turkey's survival. So he's looking at it as that this is a way for them to actually not die off like the Ottomans. He thought this would be a way of earning the respect of modern nations. If you want to think about Kemal Ataturk, you want to compare him to Emperor Meiji during the Meiji Restoration of Japan. He saw them modernizing and industrializing as a way of gaining the same authority as and respect of the Western world. But the Western world, as we saw with Meiji, they're not going to look at Ataturk as being, equal to them. And they still don't look at Turkey as being very equal to them. So here we see Kemal Ataturk, and he is not dressed as you would normally see an Arab man or the president of an Arab nation dressed. He's dressed very Western, and if you were to look at a picture of him and look at the leader of Great Britain, they would be wearing the same type of fashion. He's slowly going to weaken the power of Islam. He gets rid of Sharia law, polygamy, the office of the caliph and government. So he's going to go in almost the same direction as the Shah did in Iran, where he's going to very modernize and secularize Turkey. And then in Iran, you're going to see the rise of the Ayatollah and the removal of those things. You're not going to have that same type of removal as you saw in Turkey. So he slowly but surely replaces Arabic with the Western alphabet, which is what he teaches in Western style schools. He gets rid of the Muslim calendar in favor for the Western calendar. He goes on a way of not just changing and saying, okay, this is something that we'd like to do. We're going to make new weapons and, we're going to modernize our factories and we're going to become industrialized. But he looks at it as we're going to change our entire culture so that, being Middle Eastern is backwards and being Western is the only way to do things. All right, the literacy rates in Turkey are going to increase in 1924. More people are reading. He translates the Quran from Arabic to Turkish. He implements, math classes and makes sure that everyone is educated. And one of the biggest things that he's really going to work on, it has to do with the clothing. He encouraged Turks to wear Western clothing. Women no longer had to wear veils. They could work outside of home. They could vote. And again, this is very similar to what we would see the Shah doing. So if you look at the picture on your left and look at the picture on your right, you're going to see a very different style of clothing. And you wouldn't be able to tell that the man on the left is a Middle Eastern man. And that was really what Kemal Ataturk was going for. All right, and you can see in here the first female members of the Turkish parliament. He's going to do a lot to try to increase women's rights in Turkey. Now, one of the things that he's most famous for is the Hat Law of 1924. And in this Hat Law is when he kind of goes through and he banishes things like the fez. Women no longer have to wear veils. Now, the fez is that hat on the bottom left man's head. You no longer are going to wear that. He considers that too Middle Eastern and not European enough, not Western enough. So he's going to ban those and get rid of things like turbans. And he's going to get rid of all of these things in favor of a much more European or Western style of things like top hats and the Panama hat and the derby. So these are considered, stylish in Western world. So therefore, these are going to be the things that are going to replace veils and fezzes and turbans. And Ataturk is a big fan of this replacement. He wants to get rid of Muslim culture because he's seeing this Islamic Middle Eastern culture as being backwards and as something that the West is not ever going to accept. Turkey becomes an ally of the United States. They received support to resist communism during the Cold War. If you remember and go back to things like the Truman Plan, the Truman Plan was all about giving Turkey and Greece money to avoid becoming communism. They have applied for the European Union membership and they've been denied numerous times. They are desperate to not be considered Middle Eastern, but in fact considered European. And if you remember, we had nuclear missiles in Turkey pointed at the USSR. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the big things that had to happen was the USSR had to remove missiles from Cuba. We had to remove missiles from Turkey. Now, his big thing is secular nationalism, which is very controversial. It remains a huge issue in Turkey today, where people are not sure of how to respond to Ataturk's legacy. They don't know if it's something that they want to look at as being 100% of a positive thing. Turkey is still considered an Islamic nation, but when we are looking at the legacy that he left behind, he left this legacy of getting rid of tradition and focusing only on modern and focusing only on Western. And that is always going to be a problem when you have people who believe that, there's nothing wrong with being traditional. There's nothing wrong with following tradition. Now, one of the things that has been actually in the news very recently, if you remember, I believe we watched a current event about it where President Trump had relieved troops from the Kurdish regions of Turkey, and the Turkish troops had gone in there. They have a very large Kurdish population. They continue to advocate for a separate nation, but obviously Turkey does not want to necessarily give up that land. There have been a lot of military coups. There have been attempts at separating. Most recently, at when they were, the Kurds were fighting ISIS, and we went in on behalf of the Kurds to help, help them out and help give them independence. And the Kurds, we thanked them by then leaving them to the Turkish, who went in almost immediately after those rebels. And the goal is to have this nation of Kurdistan, which would be a nation of 40 million Kurds. And if you can see all that green, it is not just Turkey that they're trying to gain, but parts of Iran, parts of Iraq, and everywhere that the Kurds are currently living, there's conflict in those nations. There's conflict in Iraq between the Iraqis and the Kurds because the Kurds want their own nation. They want this Kurdistan. They want this separate space for themselves, this long issue of nationalism where they believe that they are not Turkish but Kurdish. They don't consider themselves Iraqi but Kurds or Iranian but Kurds. So this is a very short lecture, and tomorrow's lecture will be just as short. So I want you to be thinking about your homework that is due today, which is the primary document analysis. So you're going to use those documents, and the question you're going to think about is what personal or historical circumstances might help account for the very different understandings of Islam that are reflected in these documents. So when you are thinking about that question, I want you to be thinking about what about those documents What about where they're living? What about the time period that it's being written in? What about the culture that they're growing up in is going to influence the way that they understand Islam, practice Islam, and show Islam. As always, ladies, if you've got questions, join the Google Meet, shoot me an email, shoot me a text, let me know so I can help you. And please, ladies, as always, continue